Good day, all, and welcome to the first web session on the second segment of the program, System Thinking. The agenda for today is want to spend a little time. Well, first of all, there's a new Navigating the Environment video, version 4. Watch it. I think it's the best one yet. Finally, I did a video with as logged in as you would see it as opposed to as I see it in edit mode all the time, so that the screens should look like you will see them. I recommend it. I want to talk a little bit about program operations, which is a new segment. The program is now 13 segments as opposed to 12. What we've done with the QA calendar, what I'm doing with the web session videos, what I'm trying to do as of a couple hours ago with the web session requests. Then I want to go ahead and review, all of this should take about 5 or 10 minutes. Then go ahead and review the intent for the systems thinking thread for this week. Then ask you about the arrows, and then we'll get into doing some Q&A. The comment toward the end of last week was that this program was a lot like jumping off a cliff and figuring out how to build a parachute on the way down. And they were not commenting about the content. They were commenting about the architecture of the environment. And the comment was that it was pretty much overwhelming because there were so many various and sundry things integrated together in this environment to get it to accomplish what I thought it needed to accomplish. So based upon that feedback, a new segment of the program was developed over the weekend, and it's titled Program Operation, and that particular segment simply talks about all of the various pieces that are integrated together to make this program work. So for every one of these, when you click on it, there's a description, there's a video, and there's some references. So I explained why every one of the pieces was brought together and to actually enable this program to function in this environment. And hopefully it will go ahead and help you better understand and be more comfortable getting around in this environment. And the videos that I had intended to put on this program summary tab for all of the segments are now actually in the segment label because they're easier to see, so that you could look at the whole map and probably click on it and get to it, as opposed to putting it in any particular node. They ended up being way down at the bottom in the program, or in the segment summary, so that I've just moved them to someplace where I think that they'll be easier to get to. In terms of, because this program has evolved from being a one-time 12-segment program constrained to function over a period of 12 weeks, people commented that they wanted to start, but they couldn't start at the beginning of May when the program started, and waiting until next year was less than acceptable. And people trying to accommodate the program in 12 fixed weeks was pretty much ludicrous, considering people's ever-changing chaotic schedules and priorities. So this is now a program that you can work through at your own pace, and as you work through the individual segments, you can go ahead and post comments to the discussion threads. If you have questions, post them there. They will get answered. I am monitoring all the threads, and other people are answering each other's questions also. I would like to try and keep this set of scheduled dates for sessions, if there is somebody that really is intent on making it through this program in the 12 weeks that it was initially designed for, though additional sessions will be scheduled as needed. Now, So this is the schedule. Looking at it in this way is not the way that people normally look at schedules, so we implemented this calendar so that you can look at it the way that people normally look at things on schedules, and as new items, new sessions are scheduled, they will be put on the calendar. And the idea is that as today, at least 15 minutes before the scheduled session, the item on the calendar will turn into a link so that you can simply come here, click on the link, add your name and email address, and you'll be brought directly into the session. Simply having people subscribe for 24 sessions and not know which ones that they will be able to make it to, it just didn't make any sense. And with all of the additional sessions that will be added over time, also doesn't make any sense. But then there's the question of what sessions should be scheduled when. And it's beyond me to know when it's appropriate to schedule another session for the participants, because they've completed, a number of people completed a particular segment, and they really would like to have an interactive session to go through some questions and answers. So what I'm currently putting together is a web request form so that you can come here and simply fill this out, just click and submit it and say, I'd like to see a web session on Insight Maker or Network Magic, and you can submit this multiple times if there is more than one that you want to have a session on. And they're all building up in a spreadsheet, and when I haven't figured out what the magic number is, but when enough people have said we want a session on this, then I'll figure out when to schedule it and we'll have another session. So the way that the program interacts is evolving readily based upon feedback from the participants in terms of just trying to figure out how to accommodate their needs and their ever-changing schedules. So this updates page looks oh, I know where. Sorry. This updates page looks like a nightmare in terms of the changes that have been made to this program in the past week and a half or 2 weeks. But I think it's beginning to settle down, hopefully. Otherwise, it may end up destroying me. So that's the current thoughts around what's evolving regarding the program operation itself. I would offer that you probably find it beneficial or informative to go ahead and go through the program operation elements. It probably take you 30 minutes or so. I mean, the videos are very short, and see if it raises questions. There is a discussion thread dedicated to that segment also, so that if you have questions, you can post them. So at this point, are there some questions on just the program operation itself, the part that I've talked about in the last 10 minutes? Okay. I didn't realize that I could possibly be that clear, but we will proceed. Oh, in the new version of the Navigating the Environment, I talked more about using the focus and the ways that you can walk through the environment, or being able to search for things that if you want to. So the intent of this segment, oh, and I've also added arrows on here. Hopefully it will make it a little bit more understandable. People told me that well, they commented that yes, it starts with green and ends with red, but that doesn't help colorblind people, though usually people don't start with something called summary unless you just like to read the last chapter of the book first. The intent of this segment was to begin to develop an understanding of the concepts and the vocabulary associated with systems thinking. Not extensive and overwhelming, though enough so that if you end up in some of the systems thinking literature, you won't find yourself lost in terms of the things that they talk about and trying to figure out how to relate to them. So the idea was to sort of provide an understanding of what a system is, the characteristics of a system, and the posts on the discussion thread for the last week have been marvelous in terms of a lot of interactions between the participants, some confusion here and there, though that's expected. The thing that I would offer, though, is in this arena, seldom will you find one specific, explicit answer. We end up dealing with multiple perspectives on an ongoing basis. Trying to find a single definition of a system is probably not a meaningful undertaking, because the way the system is defined depends upon the intent. So that because from the Bertalanffy definition that a system is an entity whose existence is maintained through the interaction of its parts, and the addition of that came up from someplace about there are characteristics that emerge from that interaction which you cannot find as characteristics of any of the parts. That works well for something like an alarm clock, that all of the components are fixed and the interactions are constant, ongoing, and don't change on an ongoing basis. Though if you talk about a team and its interactions with the other rest of the organization, and the nature of what it does and the way that it contributes, you end up having to define the system as a set of perspectives based upon the purpose that you're trying to give meaning to. So that's why I say that whenever I'm talking with someone and they say, and you have to look at the system, my immediate response is, what does that mean? Because I want to know what are the elements that they think are part of the system, and what are the interactions that are relevant, and where is the boundary that separates what they call the system from its environment, and what are the interactions between that thing they call the system and its environment. And unless I establish an awareness or an understanding of what they mean regarding all of those pieces, we end up talking past each other all the time, and we're not actually communicating, because they're talking about what they think the system is, and I'm talking about my assumptions as to what I think they mean by the system. So that it requires an understanding of what the things are that are interacting in what way, where the boundary is for that set of interactions, and the nature of that set of interactions interacting with its environment. Are there any questions about that? About the concept of system?
No questions yet, Gene. Please.
Okay. What, Gerd, after this session, why don't we have a communication as to why the dashed arrows are not dashed on your system? So then, from the concept of system, in other words, I think it's essential to understand the concept of system before one can understand systems thinking. Though the evolution is very straightforward, if you admit that the system, to understand the system, you have to know what the interacting components are and where the boundary is, and what's outside the boundary and what's in the boundary. So you have to think about all of those entities and the intent for. In other words, if I have a situation that I'm trying to deal with, I fabricate a system based upon all of the relevant interactions that come to play with regard to that situation I'm trying to figure out how to deal with. And though there is a boundary that I wrap around that says the boundary defines the extent of what it is that we're able to address, and outside that boundary is the environment that because we can't address the environment, we have to figure out inside of what I define to be the system to deal with it. And the other reason, or the other aspect to think about in terms of boundary, even if though once I define this context that I refer to as the system, typically there are multiple stakeholders who are responsible for various interactions within that context. And it is essential that those stakeholders who are responsible for portions of this interaction come together to figure out how to address the situation. Because if the consultant goes in and looks at the situation and solves the problem or figures out a solution to the problem, at least in their mind, they then have to figure out how to sell that solution to the stakeholders, who don't own it, and sometimes they buy and sometimes they don't. I mean, one of my favorite questions is, why don't people wash their rental cars? And it's because there's no sense of ownership. So if you want a strategy for dealing with a situation to get implemented in a meaningful way, it needs to be owned by the stakeholders who are responsible for it being the problem that it is. So all of that goes into what I consider to be systems thinking. Questions now?
Yes, Gene. There's no questions, but there's a comment by Jared Muller. In this context, a discussion with Heidi, what should be in or out was helpful. This really drives the purpose of the model. And I think he's referring to the LinkedIn discussion. Another comment is from Nicholas, who says, one thing to remember about systems from the approach of intent is that observers will also have vested interests. And the trick is often to get those observers to understand the system from a broader perspective. So I'd love to see what you think about this.
Yeah, yes, those stakeholders have multiple intents, and when we get to the Enabling a Better Tomorrow session, that will come to the surface painfully so. Though, as I said, the stakeholders who own pieces of the puzzle have to come together to figure out how to address the situation. Is it on here? Let me see. Let me look. Boundaries. Okay. This particular model, I liked this model because there's a situation caused by early discharges from the hospital. It ends up in having patients end up in post-hospital services before they actually ought to be there, which ends up increasing readmissions to the hospital, which the community is not happy about, and neither is the hospital. So, though, if you ask the people that work in the hospital about the system, this is what they consider to be the system. And if you ask the people that work in post-hospital services about the system, this is the system, and everything outside they consider the environment. And the community thinks about the demand and readmissions, and that's the extent of their perception of the system. And if the situation that's created by early hospital discharges is to be addressed, the community, the hospital, and the post-hospital services have to collectively come together to figure out what to do about it because they each own a piece of the puzzle. There is no one group who can figure out how to appropriately address the situation because they don't own enough of it. Did that help? Next question, Suraj. Are you there, Suraj? Don't know where Suraj went. I'm looking for another question to answer. There's a question about recommendations for drawing the border narrower and have it simpler to understand. Well, for any particular situation, you can draw the border small enough so that you can address it, though you're not likely to be able to actually really address the situation in a meaningful way. The system that you define needs to encompass all of the meaningful relationships that come to bear on the situation that you're trying to figure out how to deal with. Trying to figure out what are the meaningful relationships is often a bit more of an art than a science. As you develop the models, you put things in and you take them out, and you put things in and you take them out. It's a very much a trial and learning exercise to attempt to figure out what's relevant. So oftentimes it's more often to leave them in and indicate that you have considered them and they're not relevant, because then when people look at the model that you've defined, they don't ask about, well, did you consider this or did you consider this? You have it included in the model with an indication that at this point it's not considered to be relevant. And so the way that I phrase it is that a model, the purpose of a model is to promote understanding. And whether or not it's a good model or not depends upon the extent to which it serves that purpose amongst the people who need to employ it to figure out how to deal with the situation. Suraj, you said something about, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and I have some questions for you.
Oh, okay. All right. Next one.
All right. The first question is, what are your recommendations to draw a border narrow and have a simpler to understand system, and to draw the border wider and have a risk to get lost in the details? Is there a rule of thumb?
No, there is, as far as I know, there's no rule of thumb, and I'll sort of reiterate the same thing that I said a moment ago. It's not whether it's narrow or broad in terms of, I mean, it has to be appropriate to address the situation. Otherwise, all of the participants are essentially wasting their time because they're doomed to failure before they start. If you, what's Covey says, you gotta focus on the domain of influence before you can address the domain of concern, because if you end up expending all your energy on the domain of concern, you end up, just running out of gas, and you're not going to make any progress because you don't have any influence over it. So that this is why I think it makes sense from the perspective that I have seen referenced over and over again. Rather than start with the system, I have to start with the situation that I'm trying to figure out how to address, and I fabricate or construct the system around that based upon what it appears is relevant, with the understanding that, because of what Ackoff continued to say that no matter where it is that you think you seem to have found the problem, the way to deal with that problem is almost always someplace else. So I end up with a problem that sales are off. So I can spend all of my, I mean, it's like the person who lost their keys and they're looking for them under the lamppost because it's easier to see there. So I think I've got a sales problem because sales are off. So I spend all my time trying to figure out what the sales department is doing wrong. And it has nothing to do with the sales department. It has to do with production and delivery. Our customers are becoming annoyed about the longer and longer delivery times, so they're buying from somebody else. So you have to start where the situation appears, and you have to build all of the relevant influences until you figure out where the leverage points are to actually deal with the situation. Next.
Great. And there are a lot of questions around this boundary question. Next one is, what about stakeholders who are outside the system boundary? Will a new boundary have to be redrawn? How is that handled?
Well, if they're a stakeholder and they're outside of the boundary, then, and they are responsible for some aspect of the situation being the way it is that you want to address, unless you redraw the boundary and get them involved, you're wasting your time because you can't succeed.
Thank you. This is a great question. A lot of follow-up questions on this, which means all the stakeholders should have systems thinking like mine, or else it's difficult to put together to achieve a meaningful goal. That's an amazing statement.
Read it again, so a little louder.
What he's saying is that based on everything you've said and his understanding, Rupam Kumar, it means that all stakeholders should have an ST like mine, systems thinking like mine, or it's difficult to put together a meaningful goal.
I'd prefer to work in that environment.
Absolutely. Okay, more follow-up questions, by the way. I think that this boundary question is making everyone pose a lot of questions to you.
A boundary is a tough aspect.
Yes, it is. It is. All right. Jim McGee asks, what advice would you offer on striking a balance between working outwards versus inwards in selecting useful boundaries?
Working outward. I'm going to answer, though I'm not sure I understand the question. Mm-hmm. Though I think I'm trying not to be redundant, but it feels like it's going to come out redundant in that that the primary definition of the boundary is what's inside and what's outside. What's inside is addressable and what's outside is not addressable. So that if there is something that's outside the boundary that has a critical influence on the current situation that you can't mitigate, you can't deal with the situation because the stakeholder that's outside the boundary is governing the current situation unless the boundary is expanded to include them and they become involved and choose to do something. Then, though the way that you get them in the boundary and they choose to be involved varies to a great degree. I mean, you have a company that's polluting the rivers that are flowing into town, and it's not in their best interest from a cost perspective to do anything about it because it costs to process the waste. So the way that one gets them involved is you publish news stories on a daily basis about the level of pollution that they're delivering to the river, and you get their attention. And begin to work with them to figure out how to deal with the situation because they don't like the negative publicity.
Nice. There are many follow-up questions to this boundary question, and I'm going to restrict this to the last one, and we'll handle everything on the LinkedIn group is what I feel. A follow-up to my boundary question, this is by Rahman. At the time the system boundary was defined, it was believed that all the parts and stakeholders had been identified. Then a solution was designed, but based on the solution, it has now been identified that some stakeholders were not included, which never happens in our life. How does one prevent that from happening?
You can't prevent it from happening. What you do is you continue to operate from the perspective of saying, this is what I understand, and I also admit that I don't understand everything, so that I'm constantly sensing and adjusting, looking for additional feedback to tell me whether or not I should continue to move forward in the direction that I'm going, or should I in fact back up and expand the boundary and get additional people involved and then move forward.
Great. Another good question this time, could you please provide a definition of relevance?
Relevance?
What attributes should a component subsystem have in order to be relevant?
It has to have an influence on the situation, or in other words, I can have things that are influencing the current situation the way that it is, and in the process, the stakeholders have decided to do these things which cause the situation to be different. And in that different state, there are new influences that weren't there before, because things have changed, and now maybe somebody else or some other stakeholders are now part of the puzzle because of what we've changed. I think I got lost in my own answer. I do that sometimes.
Another good question from Jim. Do you need a higher level of control in things like the hospital model to avoid tribalism, clashes of identity, emphasis creating antagonism?
Control is an illusion.
I thought you'd say that.
Well, it is. I mean, the stakeholders have to get involved because for some reason or another it makes sense to them to be involved. In other words, you need a basis for that. In other words, if you look at the Jackson model, where is it? The Jackson framework. It troubled me greatly for years as to why this thing called systems thinking had to have a myriad of models and methods that were employed to do systems thinking. Well, part of it I came to understand because nobody makes a name for themselves peddling somebody else's model or method, so everybody's out there trying to create a new one of their own. So that's where a lot of them come from. Though from this particular matrix that Jackson put together in terms of having systems which are simple or complex, simple meaning some number of interactions which are relatively constant or consistent over time, and complex in terms of lots of interactions that are probably not the same tomorrow as they are today. I mean, there's the difference between a clock and this mess down here. And participants, which are unitary, pluralist, or coercive based upon the extent to which they are lined up in terms of their goals, objectives, values, and beliefs. So that in this particular instance, with a complex unitary environment, you can use these kind of approaches to deal with the situation, because what you're probably trying to do is to improve goal seeking and viability. But when you get into this arena where the participants have compatible basic interests, but they're not completely lined up, what you end up spending the initial part of your time doing is exploring purpose to figure out what it is that's meaningful for the collective group of stakeholders to identify as why it is that they're doing something together as opposed to being enemies. Though when you get over into these environments, people don't want to agree on much of anything, so that you end up over here trying to promote fairness, or down here promote diversity, which is about the best that you can accomplish if you're dealing with a situation in a coercive, simple, or complex environment. So I mean, for me, this was a real eye-opener to say, if you are in this context and you think you are going to solve the problem, you're Looney Tunes. You're wasting your time, because it's not going to happen. The stakeholders will never come together. They won't even agree what the problem is. I hope that helped. Sorry. Next.
Okay, Gene, I think you can continue now.
I can continue.
I don't have any more questions for you.
Okay. This I think is a good point to remember, or to realize. Some people discover systems thinking and they become evangelists, and they decide that analysis is bad and no one should ever do analysis again, and it's the wrong approach, because I think that analysis and synthesis are two sides of the same coin. So you do analysis to understand the interactions of things inside of the system, that set of relationships, though you also have to understand how that system interacts with a larger context. The comment that Ackoff made that I found really brought things really home was that by analysis I can understand the way the clock works. But I can study that clock forever and never understand why the segments on that clock are the size that they are. Not until I study that clock in the context of the rotation of the Earth and understand why 24 hours is segmented into hours and minutes on that clock, do I understand how it keeps, or what time is. So that the analysis and synthesis are both appropriate. If you want really good results, you do both. Any new questions?
Yes, and I think this could be more a follow-up by email or LinkedIn. Are there additional resources available to more about the Jackson model? This seems critical for identifying the environment in which we are working.
Right here, this link is a PDF version of Jackson's book. You can download it. It's a wonderful piece of work. At one point in time, well, because of the way that I came to this, at one point in time, I thought systems thinking was just a not very grown-up version of system dynamics. Fortunately, I grew up. And it was to a great part because of Jackson that my understanding expanded. So here's Jackson's book on a Kindle version on Amazon, and here's a downloadable PDF version, and here's the summary of it on my wiki page.
Thank you. Next question.
And
this is from Brian. Yeah, go ahead.
In other words, the reason that I really recommend that as you're going through the material, if you have questions and comments, just please go and post them to the discussion thread, because people post questions, and the answers cause me to go add things to the content for the program itself, or people post links to other things that are meaningful, and they get captured in the library here. And so I mean, this interaction for a web session is meaningful in terms of sort of bringing the whole set of content together, though the best way to get a timely response to the question that comes to mind when you're going through the material is post it to the discussion thread. I'm only up 24 hours a day, so or almost.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the way you have brought everything together. And I agree that the program operations is complex, but that's how you deal with this kind of a subject in depth. So I'm really happy with everything that's being shown. I have a very good question, which I think is a basic question. A lot of people have asked me this also. So thanks to Klaus for asking this question. Can you please explain the difference between systems thinking and systems dynamics?
Okay. The answer to the question depends upon who you ask. I'm sorry. System. All right. Before. Okay. There's probably understanding, enabling, systems thinking evolution. Okay. Back in the 30s and 40s, Weiner and Bertalanffy and a few other people were the forefront of the systems movement. And to most people, Bertalanffy is the father of modern systems theory. And they developed approaches for things, though what happened was they found out that the approaches didn't deal with situations, so they developed new approaches to things, and we ended up with soft systems and the rest of this. And someplace right here, which is not on this chart because I didn't create this chart, J.W. Forrester invented system dynamics at MIT as an approach to dealing with some real live problems that they were trying to figure out how to deal with. System dynamics is an approach to developing very well structured models that one can simulate, so that you define the model and say, here's what I think the relative relationships are, and here's the set of assumptions that I believe are appropriate, and then you have the computer simulate that model out into time, so that the computer does a time compression for you to show you the implications of those actions over time. Causal loop diagrams were an outgrowth of system dynamics because they developed some models and they wanted a way to present their findings to people, and they were concerned that the stock and flow diagrams would just be overwhelming. So they fabricated causal loop diagrams. Causal loop diagrams sort of got accepted by a part of the U.S. arena as systems thinking, so that there are people and organizations who teach systems thinking, and they're essentially teaching understanding things by drawing causal loop diagrams. Causal loop diagrams can provide a wealth of understanding about a set of relationships until you ask certain questions like how long or how much, because it's just a picture. There's no, and you can prove a lot of things with a picture and smoke and mirrors and hand waving. With stock and flow diagrams, it's real and tangible in that you say, here's the model and here's what I think, and the model then says, okay, here are the implications of what you think. My own experience developing simulation models, stock and flow and system dynamics types of things, is I define the model, I tell it my assumptions, and it usually tells me that either my model is wrong or my assumptions are wrong, because a reality is not that bizarre. So it's a learning experience between me and the model, and we go around and around and around over a period of time and finally get to a point where the model seems to be consistent with reality, and I learned something. So system dynamics is a explicitly designed or defined methodology for developing simulations. In the Jackson framework, system dynamics is one of the types of things that you employ when dealing with complex unitary environments. From the European or the broader perspective, all of this constitutes systems thinking. Even the unitary simple operations research, systems analysis, systems engineering falls within the framework of systems thinking from the broadest perspective. And I like this one. I think the other one is just way too narrow. Too narrow to be useful.
Thanks, Gene. Another follow-up question. Again, this concept has many questions coming up. What's the difference between systems thinking, systems engineering, and industrial and systems engineering?
Read the question again. Systems.
Let's take the first one, which is systems thinking versus systems engineering.
All right. Those things in this category, relatively simple systems with well-defined interactions, are things that you can engineer. You can think about engineering a clock. You can't think about engineering this mess down here on the bottom. So that from an analysis perspective, you can figure out what the pieces are and how they need to fit together, and it works the way you design it to work.
Great, thank you.
To me, that's the difference between systems thinking and systems engineering. It's what it is you're trying to figure out how to deal with. I use systems thinking to help me understand something. I use systems engineering as an approach to actually designing and building something.
Okay, next one. There's more a comment and maybe a request for clarification. Can we say that systems dynamics derive cause and effect, but systems thinking is more an analysis of the environment?
Read it one more time. It's
okay.
Tricky.
So he says, can we assume that systems dynamics is about deriving cause and effect, more result orientation, whereas systems thinking is an analysis of the environment?
System dynamics is a method within the systems thinking framework for approaching certain types of situations or developing an understanding of certain kinds of problems. Senge said systems thinking is a discipline. It's the fifth discipline. And within that, certain people such as the have developed habits of a systems thinker, the kinds of things that you do on an ongoing basis. The difficulty with this is what order do you do them in? I mean, they're just, it's a set of guidelines, and you just, it's all mishmash. There's no order to it. System dynamics has a well-defined process for developing reference modes and then developing a model and simulating it and continuing to change things until it matches the reference modes, and developing a level of validity to that particular situation so that you're comfortable relying on the model. So I prefer to think about systems thinking as a much broader perspective Bertalanffy said that it's a worldview. It's a way of looking at the world and realizing that the relationships between things are often far more important than the things themselves. I hope that helped. And it's
all right. Very interesting question by Anthony. I'm not clear what coercive participants are. Can you explain that?
How about the Democrats and Republicans? They don't agree on anything. They have no idea. They have no collective opinion as to what the problem is that they're trying to deal with. You can't develop, you can't go do soft systems thinking or develop a system dynamics model to help them because there's no definition of what the problem is, or there's no agreement as to what it is they need to address to do whatever they think they're trying to do. Or look at the situation in the Middle East.
Nice, thank you. Brian asks a question from the discussion board. He talks about processes and procedures and systems. Can systems tools be used to analyze them safely?
Can what?
Can systems tools be used to analyze the processes and procedure systems safely?
Safely?
Apparently, yeah, this is a question from the discussion board.
Well, I mean, often, no. It's good to build models and evaluate the models and do simulations to get a sense of the implications of changing things, because it's very disruptive to go experiment with organizations. I mean, they don't like it at all. And if you do something that's inappropriate, I mean, you might melt the thing down. So that, I mean, part of the real benefit of doing simulation modeling is that you can get a sense of what is likely to happen. It's not a forecast, though. It's the intent of the simulation is to help you better understand more than you can just from a qualitative model. And it's safer than it is to actually go and putz around with the real thing. Is that an answer?
Yeah. Next question is asking about systems dynamics. Why do you think systems dynamics is mostly related to problems with unitary participants? Why can't you also look at systems dynamics in the case of pluralist participants, or for that matter, coercive
because
participants?
to solve a problem, you need to know what the problem is. And if the stakeholders can't agree on what the problem is, how do you know what to solve? I mean, I can't. If you and I are at odds about what we are trying to accomplish, how do we build a model to help us understand how to accomplish it? And that's why there are a different set of methods that one employs in this arena to help the participants figure out what the meaningful purpose is. And once they get to a point of agreeing on the purpose, well, then you can go do SD models.
Great, thank you. Nicholas asks if you're familiar with assessment tools like backcasting.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not opposed to being. It's just something I've just not gotten to.
Okay. Next question is also interesting. In the Jackson model, is coercive often ideological rather than pragmatic?
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
That's really an interesting question. So let me ask him to just say it again. Aaron, could you clarify that question? I think it's interesting, but we need some more data.
You got another one?
Yeah, I do. This from Harry. So first, you need to identify the problem and use systems dynamics for that problem.
For what? For?
I assume he's talking about identifying the nature of the system and the participants, and then deciding which method to use.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
So that I think I've identified a situation that I think needs to be addressed. And as I think about it and understand what's related, I figure out that Harry and Ralph and Tom and Jane and Susie all own a piece of the puzzle. So that, okay, I have to begin to get all of these stakeholders involved. And once I begin to get a sense of where they are, then I begin to get a sense of, well, are we lined up on our goals and values, and do we have a clear sense of what we need to accomplish? Or are these people at odds with each other? They're all doing silo protection, and you know, they're happy being at odds with each other because it's in their own best interest. So do we have to do stuff over here to figure out how to get over here so we can get over here? I think.
Nice. Okay, so here's a follow-up to the coercive question. So the question was, in the Jackson's model, is coercive an ideological or pragmatic capture of the participants? And the follow-up is it related to the intent to control the outcome rather than solve a given problem? It's a good perspective, by the way.
Well, the cause of the coerciveness might be ideological, and it might be pragmatic. It could be either one. I really don't want to go there, but we have people that believe in a woman's right to choose abortion, and we have pro-life people. They absolutely don't agree, and they are going to great ends to figure out how to accomplish what they believe. So that's ideological, right? It's based on a different ideology. Though there are also situations where people are protecting their rice bowls. It's very pragmatic. Anything that we do, I will lose part of what I sense is mine. And I'm not interested in cooperating with anyone that means that I will lose part of what I think is mine.
Great. An interesting question talks about the theory of change methods and tools. Do you think that they are part of the systems thinking tools and methods family? And if yes, then can you explain more?
The change management is probably not a good. Most of the change management stuff is a bunch of hooey, okay? Because it does not have a systemic foundation. I mean, what percentage of the change initiatives done in organizations actually result in a meaningful end? Right? I only spent 30-some years in organizations, and I probably only experienced one or two in all those years. Sorry. You asked.
All right. He was actually talking about theory of change, not change management. But we can move on. Let's move on.
Well, change is an important thing that needs to happen. Change actually does happen on an ongoing basis. It's just generally not change that was actually facilitated with any amount of foresight and planning. The nature of in other words, the organizations exist in a state of dynamic equilibrium, which means they're sort of stable but evolving on an ongoing basis.
All right, let's move on.
Okay. Do we have another question?
Yes, we do actually. Again, a question from the forum, so I don't know if you remember the background. How would you comment the systems versus process issue? How do they relate?
I have Robert Hardy's comment sitting here in front of me that I've been pondering since he posted it yesterday about procedures are static, no behavior associated with procedures, processes are dynamic, action, and systems are behavioral, interactions and emergent behavior. And I'll post an answer back to the forum as soon as I figure out what I think. You have to understand that what I think today may not be the same thing I think tomorrow, because I'm not convinced that I have sound answers to anything. All I have are a set of perspectives on the current level of understanding and ignorance that I operate under. So I can't answer the question at the moment.
All right. I think there's another great question. Can you talk about your experiences when you were brought in as a consultant and all the participants wanted from you were checklists, methods, templates? How do you have them understand the value of systems thinking? This one is a tough one.
Okay. For 70 years now, people have been attempting to sell systems thinking to the world, and it has been a dismal failure. I mean, a few people end up embracing it. I mean, they get to a point where they understand and they embrace it and they become evangelists, and then they go try to sell it to everybody else and they become frustrated because they can't do that, because the results aren't there. And I think it stems from the perspective that Blanchard offered in the 1-minute salesperson. He said that while almost everyone loves to buy, practically no one likes to be sold. And it goes back to my own experience of actually trying to do this and failing for 30-some years. And some of you have probably heard this, that people used to ask me, what do you do? And as I started to tell them, you could see their eyes glaze over, and the story going through their head was, why did I ask, and how do I get him to stop? And then one day somebody said, what do you do? And I said, we figure out how to solve problems so they stay solved and not create new ones in the process. And they said, wow, I want to know more. And I didn't know what to say because nobody ever said that before. So that and is the statement absolutely correct? No, but it's the intent to actually develop. I mean, most people are comfortable admitting that the majority of today's problems are the direct result of yesterday's solutions, which means we're not very good at developing solutions because we just create more problems in the process. Though systems thinking, I believe, offers hope to better develop approaches to dealing with situations so we don't continually shoot ourselves in the foot. Though there's a way that we have to go about it to accommodate or accomplish that, and most of it is in where? In segment 5, or at least a thought about an approach is in segment 5, and I don't think I can give you 10 modules in 15 seconds. So be patient. It's coming. Bring it up again later. We need to build. It's difficult to swallow the whole elephant at once. Just take it bite by bite. Bear with me.
Great. Do you want me to continue to the next question?
Well, actually, we ought to begin to wrap this up.
Yeah. That's right.
I thank you very much, Suraj. This has been very helpful. It's a good thing you missed the first session, or if you were at the first session, it was chaotic. I mean, it ends up wasting people's times trying to sort of ferret through the list of questions and figure out the ones that are appropriate to respond to. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So for the questions that are still left, please post them to the discussion forum, and we will address them. And come to the session on Thursday if you want more. And because I expect that the Thursday session will be different because people will be asking different questions about the same content, and I'm interested to see what I have to think. All right. I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you much.